Grace Williams arrived at the Cole mansion thinking it would be just another housekeeping job. But when she noticed 6-year-old Lila clutching her head in silent agony and felt something hard and unnatural hidden beneath the child's scalp, she realized this deaf girl was carrying a dangerous secret, one that her millionaire father desperately wanted buried, and Grace, a woman haunted by her own brother's death from a medical experiment, gone wrong, was about to make a choice that would either save an innocent child or destroy them both. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is care enough to ask the questions no one wants answered. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun cast golden streaks across the glass and steel mansion perched on the outskirts of Atlanta. Grace Williams arrived at 5:30, just as she did every morning, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She was 28 years old, with kind eyes that carried the weight of old sorrows and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. The massive iron gates opened automatically as her security badge beeped, and she walked up the stone pathway lined with perfectly manicured hedges. Inside, the house was silent except for the soft hum of climate control. Grace moved through the sprawling kitchen, her footsteps muted against the polished marble floor. She hummed an old gospel tune under her breath, something her grandmother used to sing as she pulled out eggs, butter, and fresh strawberries from the industrial-sized refrigerator. The kitchen was larger than her entire apartment, all stainless steel and gleaming surfaces, but she'd learned every corner of it over the past 2 years. As she whisked eggs in a ceramic bowl, Grace's mind wandered to the faces she'd left behind. Her brother, Marcus, who died 3 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. The doctors had called it complications from surgery, but Grace knew better. She'd heard the whispers about experimental procedures, about a biotech company that used patients like lab rats. She'd tried to sue, but lawyers cost money she didn't have, and the company had vanished behind legal walls she couldn't climb. The sound of small footsteps pulled her back to the present. Grace turned and smiled as Lila Cole appeared in the doorway, her chestnut hair tangled from sleep, her big blue eyes still heavy with dreams. The 6-year-old wore pink pajamas decorated with cartoon rabbits, and she clutched a tablet against her chest like a treasured companion. Lila patted across the floor and held up the tablet. The screen displayed a text-to-speech message in large, friendly letters. "Good morning, Miss Grace." Grace set down the whisk and knelt to the child's level, her smile widening. She signed slowly with her hands, forming the words, "Good morning, sweetheart," in American Sign Language. Lila's face lit up, and she signed back clumsily, her small fingers struggling with the shapes. Grace had been teaching her for months now, supplementing the formal lessons Lila received from her specialized tutor. The child was born deaf. Completely, profoundly deaf. Grace had learned this on her first day of work, when Ethan Cole, the girl's father, had handed her a laminated instruction sheet about communicating with his daughter. "No loud noises necessary," the sheet had read. "She can't hear them anyway." "Are you hungry?" Grace signed, exaggerating her mouth movements. Lila nodded enthusiastically and climbed onto one of the high-backed chairs at the kitchen island. Grace returned to the stove, cracking eggs into a heated pan. She glanced at the child from the corner of her eye, watching as Lila played with a digital drawing app on her tablet, her tongue poking out in concentration. There was something pure about Lila, something untouched by the coldness that seemed to permeate the rest of this house. Grace had worked in wealthy homes before, but none felt quite as lonely as this one. For all its beauty and expensive furnishings, it felt like a museum, like something designed to be admired from a distance but never truly lived in. The sharp click of dress shoes announced Ethan Cole's arrival before he appeared. Grace didn't turn around, but she felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Ethan was 39 years old, tall and lean, with sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't so carefully controlled. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 3 months, and his dark hair was styled with precision. Everything about him screamed control, from his posture to the way he checked his watch as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," Grace said quietly, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate. Ethan didn't respond. He never did, not really. He walked to Lila and kissed the top of her head, a gesture that seemed automatic rather than affectionate. Lila looked up and signed something that Grace recognized as Daddy, but Ethan simply patted her shoulder and moved to the coffee maker. Grace placed the plate in front of Lila, along with sliced strawberries arranged in a smiley face. The little girl clapped her hands silently and picked up her fork. Grace returned to the counter, pouring freshly brewed coffee into a thermos for Ethan. She'd learned he preferred it black, scalding hot, in a specific brand of travel mug. The silence between Grace and Ethan was heavy, filled with unspoken boundaries. He never asked about her life, never made small talk, never even looked directly at her unless absolutely necessary. Grace had learned to accept it. She was staff, nothing more. Invisible labor that kept his world running smoothly. But sometimes she caught him watching her interact with Lila. Those moments unsettled her. His expression would shift, just slightly. Something that looked almost like discomfort, or maybe jealousy. Grace couldn't quite place it. It was as if seeing his daughter laugh and play with the help reminded him of something he'd lost or never had. Ethan took his coffee and briefcase, checked his watch again, and headed for the door. He paused and turned back. "Dr. Pennington is coming at 2, he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Make sure Lila is ready." "Yes, sir," Grace replied. He left without another word. The front door closed with a heavy thud that echoed through the cavernous entryway. Grace exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and Lila looked up at her with those impossibly blue eyes. The girl signed a question that Grace had taught her weeks ago. "Why is Daddy sad?" Grace's heart clenched. She knelt beside the chair and brushed a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. "He's not sad, baby. He's just busy. Important people are always busy." Even as she said it, she wondered if she believed it herself. After breakfast, Grace cleaned the kitchen while Lila settled in the sunroom with her coloring books. The house had 12 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a home theater, an indoor pool, and enough square footage to house a small village. Grace moved through it methodically, dusting surfaces that rarely gathered dust, straightening pillows that were already perfectly arranged. In the main hallway, a large portrait hung above an antique console table. It showed Ethan, younger and almost smiling, standing beside a beautiful woman with auburn hair and warm, hazel eyes. The woman held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Grace paused, as she always did when passing this portrait, studying the woman's face. Clara Cole, Ethan's late wife, Lila's mother. Grace knew very little about her. The other staff members, the ones who'd worked here longer, spoke about Clara in hushed tones, as if saying her name too loudly might summon a ghost. She'd died during childbirth, that much was certain. But the details were murky, contradictory. Some said it was a hemorrhage. Others whispered about complications no one could have predicted. One housekeeper, an older woman named Diane, who'd since retired, had once muttered something that stuck with Grace. That poor woman didn't die from childbirth. She died from what they did to her beforehand. Grace had pressed for more information, but Diane had clammed up, fear clouding her eyes. "Don't go digging," she'd warned. "Mr. Cole doesn't like questions about his wife. People who ask too many questions don't last long here." Grace studied the portrait now, noting the crack that spiderwebbed across the glass, right over Clara's face. She'd asked about getting it repaired once, and Ethan had snapped at her so viciously that she'd never mentioned it again. The crack remained, a permanent fissure across a dead woman's smile. A small hand tugged at Grace's sleeve. Lila stood there, holding up a drawing of what appeared to be a rainbow made of purple and orange. Grace smiled and signed her approval. They walked together to Lila's bedroom, a princess paradise of soft pinks and lavenders with a canopy bed and shelves filled with untouched toys. Grace began tidying up while Lila played with a dollhouse in the corner. As Grace bent to retrieve scattered crayons from under the bed, she heard something strange. A faint metallic buzzing, like a fly trapped in a jar. She froze, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from near Lila. Grace looked up. Lila had stopped playing and was pressing both palms against her ears, her face scrunched in discomfort. Grace rushed over and knelt beside her. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she said aloud, knowing Lila couldn't hear her but hoping the girl could read the concern on her face. Lila's eyes were squeezed shut. Her small body trembled. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the moment passed. Lila's face relaxed. She opened her eyes and looked at Grace, then signed something that made Grace's stomach flip. "It tickles." "What tickles?" Grace signed back, but Lila just giggled and returned to her dollhouse as if nothing had happened. Grace sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. She'd seen children have seizures before, briefly, during her time volunteering at a community center. But this didn't look like that. Lila seemed completely fine now, chattering away in her own silent language, moving dolls through the tiny plastic rooms. As Grace stood to leave, something caught her eye beneath the bed's dust ruffle. She reached down and pulled out a small metal object, no bigger than a button. It was tarnished silver, etched with an intricate design that looked like an infinity symbol, the two loops intertwining in an endless pattern. Grace turned it over in her palm, feeling its surprising weight. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, and the etching seemed to catch the light in strange ways. She'd never seen Lila with this before. Grace slipped it into her apron pocket, making a mental note to ask about it later, though some instinct told her to keep it quiet. There was something about the object that felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. At 2 o'clock sharp, Dr. Pennington arrived. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look perpetually concerned. Grace had seen him several times before during his routine checkups with Lila. He carried a leather medical bag and always smelled faintly of peppermint. Grace led him to the study where Ethan was working. She knocked softly and opened the door. Ethan looked up from his laptop, his expression neutral. "Dr. Pennington is here, sir." "Send him in," Ethan said, "and bring Lila." Grace fetched the little girl from her room, and they walked hand in hand to the study. Lila seemed nervous, gripping Grace's fingers tightly. Grace gave her an encouraging smile and signed, "It's okay, just the doctor." Inside the study, Dr. Pennington had set up his equipment on Ethan's massive oak desk. He smiled warmly at Lila and gestured for her to sit in the leather chair. Grace stood by the door, ready to leave, but Ethan said, "Stay, in case she needs you." Grace nodded and moved to the corner, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. She watched as Dr. Pennington examined Lila's ears with various instruments, shining lights and making notes on a tablet. Lila sat still, accustomed to these examinations, though her eyes kept darting toward Grace for reassurance. After several minutes, Dr. Pennington removed his gloves and turned to Ethan. "Her auditory nerves show no change," he said carefully. "However, I've been following the latest developments in cochlear implant technology. There's a new surgical procedure that's showing remarkable success rates with children born with profound hearing loss. I really think we should consider it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "No. Mr. Cole, I understand your reservations, but I said no." Ethan's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "No more experiments on my daughter. She's fine as she is." Dr. Pennington glanced at Lila, who was watching the exchange with confused eyes. "With all due respect, she's not fine. She's missing an entire dimension of human experience. This procedure could..." Could what? Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Could give her hearing? Or could it fail and leave her worse off than before? Or maybe it could kill her, like the last time someone tried to play God with my family. The room fell silent. Dr. Pennington's face paled. Grace felt her breath catch. This was more than a father's overprotectiveness. This was fear, raw and visceral. "I'm sorry," Dr. Pennington said quietly. "I didn't mean to overstep." Ethan sat back down, rubbing his temples. "Just give me your report. We'll continue with speech therapy and sign language. That's enough." Grace looked at Lila and saw something that broke her heart. The little girl's face had fallen, her eyes downcast. She might not have heard the words, but she'd read the tension in the room, had seen her father's anger. She knew somehow that the door to hearing had been slammed shut once again. After Dr. Pennington left, Grace took Lila back to her room. The child was quieter than usual, sitting on her bed with her tablet in her lap, not even looking at the screen. Grace sat beside her and gently turned Lila's face toward her own. She signed slowly. "You are perfect exactly as you are. Don't ever forget that." Lila's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her small arms around Grace's neck. Grace held her, rocking slowly, wondering what kind of man would deny his child a chance at hearing. What kind of past could make someone so afraid? That evening, after her shift ended, Grace returned to her small apartment in a less affluent part of Atlanta. It was a tiny one-bedroom with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that clanked through the night, but it was hers. She made herself a simple dinner of rice and beans, then sat at her rickety kitchen table with a cup of tea and her journal. The journal had been her therapist's idea, back when she could still afford therapy. "Write down your thoughts," the woman had said. "It helps process trauma." Grace had kept writing even after the sessions stopped, filling page after page with memories, questions, and grief. Tonight, she wrote about Lila, about the strange buzzing sound and the child's discomfort, about the metal pin she'd found, which now sat on the table before her, still impossibly cold to the touch, about Ethan's violent reaction to the suggestion of surgery. She wrote about her brother Marcus, too, as she often did. Marcus had been only 23 when he died, full of dreams and terrible jokes. He'd gone in for what should have been a routine procedure to correct a heart murmur, but the hospital had been testing something new, some experimental technique funded by a biotech company. They'd asked Marcus to sign a waiver, promised him he'd be helping advance medical science. He'd been so proud, so eager to make a difference. 2 days after the surgery, he was dead. The doctors had looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet and avoiding eye contact as they explained that his body had rejected the new equipment. "These things happen," one had said, as if Marcus had been a failed batch of cookies rather than a living, breathing person. Grace closed the journal and stared at the metal pin. The infinity symbol seemed to pulse in the dim light of her kitchen. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her fingers. What was it doing in Lila's room? Who did it belong to? And why did it fill her with such unease? "Maybe helping her will make it right this time," Grace whispered to the empty apartment. If she couldn't save Marcus, maybe she could protect Lila. Maybe that would be enough to quiet the guilt that gnawed at her every night. She went to bed but didn't sleep well. Her dreams were filled with buzzing sounds and children's voices calling for help. The next morning, Grace arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. She wanted to check on Lila, to make sure the child had recovered from yesterday's disappointment. As she prepared breakfast, Lila appeared in the kitchen, bouncing on her toes with renewed energy. Children were resilient that way, Grace thought. They could cry themselves to sleep and wake up ready to face the world again. After breakfast, Grace brushed Lila's hair in the sunroom, humming softly as she worked through the tangles. Lila sat peacefully, playing a game on her tablet. Grace's fingers moved gently through the chestnut locks, sectioning and smoothing, when suddenly her hand brushed against something that didn't belong. just behind Lila's right ear, beneath the surface of the scalp. Grace felt a small, hard ridge. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but definitely there. She pressed lightly, and Lila flinched, pulling away. Grace's heart began to pound. She signed an apology and finished brushing quickly, her mind racing. What was that? A bone deformity? Scar tissue from an old injury? Or something else entirely? Over the next few days, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. During breakfast one morning, Lila suddenly froze mid-bite, her spoon clattering onto the plate. Her eyes went wide and unfocused. Grace rushed over just as Lila pressed both hands against her ears, her mouth opening in what looked like a silent scream. Lila. Grace grabbed the child's shoulders gently. What's happening? Look at me, baby. Look at me. But Lila's eyes were squeezed shut, her face contorted in pain. Grace could see the pulse in the child's neck racing, could feel the tremors running through her small body. Without thinking, Grace pressed her fingers behind Lila's ears and began massaging gently. The way she used to soothe Marcus when he had migraines. The effect was almost immediate. Lila's body relaxed, her breathing steadied. The color returned to her face. When she opened her eyes, they were clear again, though rimmed with tears. Ethan burst into the kitchen, his hair disheveled, his tie askew. He must have been upstairs and seen something on the security monitors. What happened? He demanded, rushing to Lila's side. I don't know, Grace said honestly. She just froze up like she was in pain. Ethan pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. I'm calling the doctor. Get the car ready. We're taking her to the hospital right now. But before Grace could move, Lila reached out and grabbed her father's wrist. She shook her head firmly and signed one clear word. No. Ethan stared at his daughter. You're in pain. We need to... Lila signed again, more emphatically. No hospital. I'm okay now. Grace watched the war play out on Ethan's face. Fear versus respect for his daughter's wishes. Control versus letting go. Finally, he set down his phone and pulled Lila into a tight embrace. If it happens again, he said, speaking slowly so she could read his lips. We're going. No arguments. Lila nodded against his chest, and Grace saw something in that moment that surprised her. Beneath all his coldness, beneath the walls and the distance, Ethan Cole loved his daughter desperately. He was just terrified of losing her. That night, after Lila was asleep and Ethan had retreated to his study, Grace couldn't resist. She'd been thinking about that strange ridge behind Lila's ear, about the episodes of pain, about Ethan's fear of doctors and experiments. Something connected them all, she was certain of it. Grace had been entrusted with a spare key to most rooms in the house for cleaning purposes. She'd never abused that trust before, but tonight, her curiosity outweighed her conscience. She crept to Ethan's study and slipped the key into the lock, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The study was dark except for the glow of a computer in sleep mode. Grace used her phone's flashlight to navigate, careful not to disturb anything. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. Evidence? Answers? Proof that she wasn't losing her mind? She started with the desk drawers, finding the usual items. Pens, business cards, a few framed photos face down in the bottom drawer. She pulled them out and found pictures of Clara, the late wife, smiling and pregnant. Grace's throat tightened. The woman looked so happy, so full of life. What had happened to her? Behind a false panel in one of the drawers, Grace found something that made her blood run cold. A folder labeled Project Echo in faded type. Inside were medical documents, consent forms, and photographs. Grace's hands trembled as she flipped through them, her phone's light illuminating images that would haunt her nightmares. Photos of infants with electrodes attached to their heads. diagrams of what looked like cochlear implants, but far more complex, with additional components she didn't recognize. Technical specifications filled with words like neural integration and auditory enhancement beyond natural capacity. And there, at the bottom of the stack, a patent application. Filed 8 years ago. Inventor, Ethan Cole. Company, Cole Biotech. Grace's mind reeled. Ethan had invented something, some kind of advanced implant. But why did these documents look so secretive? Why were they hidden in a false panel? She was about to dig deeper when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Grace's heart stopped. She shoved the documents back into the folder, replaced it in the drawer, and looked frantically for a hiding place. The footsteps grew closer. She could see a shadow moving past the frosted glass of the study door. Grace dove behind the heavy curtains just as the door opened. Through the fabric, she could make out Ethan's silhouette as he entered the room. He flicked on a desk lamp and sat down with a heavy sigh. Grace pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, praying he wouldn't notice the slightly disturbed papers or her phone's lingering warmth on the drawer handle. Ethan's phone rang, and he answered with a weary, "What?" A pause. Then his voice changed, becoming sharp and angry. "No, I told you the project is over. Clara died because of it. Don't you dare bring that up again." Grace's eyes widened. She strained to hear more, but Ethan had lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. She caught fragments. "Not worth the risk." And, "My daughter is not your test subject." And finally, "If you come near my family again, I'll destroy everything, all of it. I don't care what it costs me." He ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment. Grace could see his shoulders shaking. Was he crying? The thought was so at odds with the cold, controlled man she knew that she almost couldn't process it. Finally, Ethan stood and left the room, turning off the light behind him. Grace waited 5 agonizing minutes before emerging from her hiding spot. Her legs were cramped, and her heart felt like it might burst from her chest, but she'd learned something crucial. Clara hadn't died from natural childbirth complications. She'd died because of Project Echo, whatever that was. And Ethan blamed himself. But what did that have to do with Lila's mysterious episodes of pain? With the ridge behind her ear? With the strange metal pin Grace had found? Grace returned to her apartment that night with more questions than answers. She pulled out her old laptop and began searching for information about Cole Biotech. The company had dissolved 7 years ago, according to public records. No explanation given. It had simply ceased to exist, its assets absorbed by various other corporations, its research buried in legal paperwork. She found a few news articles from that time period. "Tech entrepreneur closes company after personal tragedy," read one headline. Another said, "Cole Biotech shutters amid ethics concerns," but none of them provided real details. Everything was vague, sanitized, carefully worded to avoid lawsuits. Grace searched for Project Echo, but found nothing relevant. Whatever it was, it had been kept secret. She was about to give up when she stumbled across an obscure medical journal article from 8 years ago. It discussed experimental auditory enhancement systems being developed for prenatal neural integration. Grace's breath caught as she read phrases like revolutionary hearing capabilities and potential risks to maternal neural pathways. One line made her stomach drop. Test subjects showed promising results, though ethical concerns remain regarding consent and long-term effects on both mother and child. Grace closed her laptop and stared at the wall. Ethan had experimented on Clara, on their unborn child. He'd used his wife and daughter as test subjects for some kind of advanced hearing implant, and Clara had died from it. But the experiment had been on both of them, which meant Lila had something inside her head that shouldn't be there, something that was now causing her pain. The next day, Grace went to work with renewed purpose. She needed proof before confronting Ethan. She needed to understand exactly what was happening to Lila. But as she prepared breakfast, she noticed something that made her pause. A man in a dark coat stood outside the mansion gates talking to Ethan in the driveway. Even from a distance, Grace could see the tension in their postures. The man gestured sharply, and Ethan shook his head, crossing his arms defensively. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes before the man got into a sleek black car and drove away. As Ethan walked back to the house, Grace caught a glimpse of something on the stranger's wrist. A watch, or a bracelet, she couldn't tell. But etched into the metal band was a symbol she recognized immediately. The infinity loop. The same symbol as the pin she'd found in Lila's room. Grace's hands gripped the edge of the sink. Who was that man? What did he want? And why did he have the same symbol? Later that morning, while Lila was having her tutoring session in the library, Grace approached Ethan cautiously. He was in his home office, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. "Mr. Cole," Grace said softly from the doorway. "May I speak with you?" He looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "I'm busy, Grace. It's about Lila." That got his attention. He gestured for her to enter and closed the door behind her. "What about her?" Grace took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "The episodes she's been having. The pain. I think there might be something physically wrong, something that needs to be checked." "I told you I'm not putting her through more doctors," Ethan said flatly. "I'm not talking about doctors," Grace said, her courage building. "I'm talking about what's already there, behind her ear. There's something under the skin, Mr. Cole. I felt it." Ethan's face went white, then red, then something dangerous and cold. He stood slowly, his height making Grace instinctively take a step back. "Don't ever touch my daughter's head again," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Do you understand me? But if she's in pain—" "I said don't." He slammed his hand on the desk, making Grace jump. "You have no idea what you're talking about, no idea what could happen if—" He stopped himself, breathing hard. Grace stared at him, and in that moment she saw it clearly. He wasn't angry at her. He was terrified. Terrified she'd discovered his secret. Terrified of what might happen if that secret was exposed. "I'm trying to help her," Grace said quietly. "The best way you can help her is by doing your job and staying out of medical decisions you're not qualified to make." Ethan shot back. "Now get out." Grace left the office, her hands shaking. She felt Ethan's eyes on her back as she walked away, felt the weight of his fear and anger following her down the hallway. That night, as Grace was preparing to leave, she stopped by Lila's room to say goodnight. The little girl was already in bed, her nightlight casting soft shadows across the walls. Grace knelt beside the bed and brushed a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. Lila opened her eyes and smiled sleepily. She reached out and touched Grace's cheek, then signed something that brought tears to Grace's eyes. "You're my best friend." Grace signed back. "You're mine too, sweetheart." As she stood to leave, she heard it again. The faint, metallic buzzing. She turned quickly and saw Lila grimace, pressing one hand to her ear. The sound seemed to be coming from the child herself, from inside her head. Grace rushed back to the bedside. "Does it hurt?" Lila shook her head, but her eyes told a different story. The buzzing grew louder, filling the room with an eerie, mechanical hum. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Lila looked up at Grace, with frightened eyes, and signed a question Grace didn't fully understand. "Why do I hear things that aren't there?" Grace's heart broke. She pulled the child into a hug, holding her close, and whispered words Lila couldn't hear, but maybe could feel. "I'm going to fix this, I promise. I'm going to make you safe." Outside Lila's door, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, Ethan stood frozen. He'd heard the buzzing, too. His hands trembled as he pressed them against the wall, fighting the urge to rush in, to shut it all down, to protect his daughter from the consequences of his own brilliant, terrible mistake. But he couldn't, because shutting it down might kill her. And living with it might kill her too. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own creation, and the only person who seemed capable of helping was a maid who'd already seen too much. Grace's promise to Lila echoed in her mind for days, becoming both a comfort and a burden. She'd seen the fear in that child's eyes, felt the tremors that ran through her small body during those episodes. Something had to be done, regardless of what Ethan threatened. The next evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Grace made a decision that would change everything. The mansion was silent at 2 a.m, its vast hallways dark except for the soft glow of security lights. Grace had memorized the patrol schedule of the automated cameras, knew exactly which blind spots existed in the system. She moved through the shadows like a ghost, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. The spare key felt heavy in her palm as she approached Ethan's study. She'd done this once before, but tonight felt different. Tonight she wasn't just looking for answers. She was looking for proof that could either save Lila or destroy what remained of this broken family. The lock clicked softly. Grace slipped inside and closed the door behind her, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. She couldn't risk turning on the lights, so she used her phone's flashlight, keeping the beam low and narrow. The study smelled of leather and expensive cologne, of secrets kept behind closed doors. Grace went straight for the desk, pulling open the drawer with the false panel. Her fingers found the edge and pried it loose. The Project Echo folder was still there, waiting like a sleeping snake. She pulled it out and spread the contents across the desk, photographing each page with her phone. But tonight, she dug deeper. Behind where the folder had been, she found a small metal box secured with a combination lock. Grace's fingers traced the numbers, her mind racing. What would Ethan use as a code? She tried Lila's birthday. Nothing. Clara's birthday. Nothing. Then, on impulse, she tried the date marked on Clara's death certificate, which she'd seen in one of the documents. The lock clicked open. Inside the box were items that made Grace's blood run cold. A USB drive labeled Neural Integration Protocols. Several vials of clear liquid with handwritten labels. Prototype serum, neural enhancement. And a stack of photographs that told a story more horrible than Grace could have imagined. The first photo showed Clara, heavily pregnant, lying in what looked like a medical facility. She was awake, smiling nervously at the camera. Electrodes covered her swollen belly. The next photo showed the same scene, but Clara's expression had changed to one of discomfort. Then pain. Then something that looked like terror. Grace's hands shook as she flipped through the images. Clara in a hospital bed, tubes running from her head to complex machinery. Clara holding a newborn Lila, both of them connected to the same device by thin wires. The baby's skull had been marked with surgical pen, tiny X's indicating insertion points. The final photo stopped Grace's breath completely. It showed Clara's body on an operating table, doctors surrounding her, their faces grim. Someone had written on the back in rushed handwriting, "Neural rejection, subject deceased, infant subject stable but unknown long-term effects." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back nausea. Ethan hadn't just experimented on his wife and daughter. He'd killed Clara with his ambition, his desire to play God with their ability to hear. And whatever he'd put inside Lila's head was still there, still active, still potentially deadly. She photographed everything, then carefully replaced the items exactly as she'd found them. As she was closing the box, she noticed something else tucked in the corner of the hidden compartment. A business card, worn and bent. It read, "Dr. Noah Vance, Neural Technology Specialist, Cole Biotech." Below the printed text, someone had scrawled a phone number and the words, "If anything goes wrong, Grace pocketed the card and closed the drawer. She'd gotten what she came for, but the weight of that knowledge felt crushing. How could she look at Ethan now, knowing what he'd done? How could she face Lila, knowing the child carried her mother's death sentence inside her head? As Grace reached for the door handle, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped. The steps were slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside the study door. Grace looked around frantically for a hiding place, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps resumed, moving past the door and fading down the hallway. Grace waited 5 full minutes before cracking the door open. The hallway was empty. She slipped out and made her way back through the mansion, her mind racing with everything she'd discovered. The next morning, Grace could barely look at Ethan as he came down for breakfast. He seemed different today, more tense than usual. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. Had he been to his study last night? Had he somehow known she was there? "Grace," Ethan said suddenly, making her jump. "I need to speak with you, in my office. Now." Grace's stomach dropped. She followed him through the house, her mind preparing excuses, explanations, anything that might protect her. But when they reached his office, Ethan didn't look angry. He looked defeated. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, closing the door. "For how I spoke to you the other day. You were right. There is something wrong with Lila, something I've been too afraid to face." Grace stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Was this a trap? Ethan sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "I tried to make her perfect," he whispered. "I tried to give her something no one else had. Enhanced hearing beyond normal human capacity. Clara and we both carried genes for hearing loss. I didn't want our daughter to suffer the way my mother suffered, the way Clara's father suffered. So I developed a system, a neural implant that would integrate before birth, that would give her hearing that surpassed natural ability." "You experimented on your own wife," Grace said, the words coming out harsher than she'd intended. "Clara volunteered," Ethan said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "She wanted this as much as I did. We both signed the consent forms. We both believed we were doing something revolutionary, something that would change the world. But it killed her." Ethan's face crumpled. Her brain rejected the neural link. The connection between her nervous system and the prototype implant caused a cascade failure during delivery. She died within minutes. But Lila survived, and the implant integrated with her developing neural pathways. The doctors said removing it would kill her, that it had become too intertwined with her brain structure. Grace sat down heavily in the chair across from him. "So you just left it inside her, knowing it could do the same thing to her that it did to Clara?" "It's dormant," Ethan said desperately. "Or it was supposed to be. The implant needs an external activation signal to function, something we never implemented. Without that signal, it's just inert metal and circuits. Lila can't hear because the device isn't active, but she's safe. She's alive." "Then why is she having those episodes?" Grace demanded. "Why the buzzing sounds? Why does she seem to be in pain?" Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know. The implant shouldn't be activating on its own, unless—" He trailed off, his face going pale. "Unless what?" "Unless someone is trying to turn it on remotely. Someone who has access to the original activation codes." Grace thought of the man in the dark coat, the one with the infinity symbol on his wrist. Who would do that? Who even knows about the implant? "My former partner," Ethan said bitterly. "Dr. Noah Vance. He helped design the system. When Clara died, when I shut down Cole Biotech, he disappeared. Took all the research data with him. I thought he'd given up, moved on to other projects, but if he's found a way to access Lila's implant..." Grace pulled out the business card she'd taken from the study. "Is this him?" Ethan stared at the card, his face draining of color. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is Lila." If this man can control the implant, if he's been activating it, then we need to stop him. We need to protect her. You don't understand, Ethan said, his voice rising. The implant is woven into her neural tissue. If someone tries to force it to full activation, it could cause the same cascade failure that killed Clara. Or it could burn out her auditory nerves completely. Either way, my daughter could die. Grace stood up, anger replacing her fear. So what's your plan? Just wait and hope he stops. Lock Lila away and pretend everything's fine. That's not protecting her, Ethan. That's just being a coward. Ethan shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. Don't you dare call me a coward. I've spent 6 years trying to keep her safe, trying to make sure she never has to know what I did, what I am. Well, she's going to find out eventually, Grace shot back. And when she does, she's going to hate you for lying to her, for letting her suffer when you could have done something. There's nothing I can do, Ethan roared. Don't you understand? If I touch that implant, she dies. If I do nothing, she might die. I'm trapped, and you standing here judging me doesn't help anything. The study door burst open. Lila stood there, her tablet clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. She'd clearly felt the vibrations of their shouting, had sensed the anger and terror in the air. She looked from her father to Grace, then back again, her small face crumpling. Grace knelt down immediately, opening her arms. Lila ran to her, burying her face in Grace's shoulder. Over the child's head, Grace looked at Ethan with a mixture of pity and determination. I'm not judging you, Grace said quietly. I'm trying to save her. Will you help me, or do I have to do this alone? Ethan looked at his daughter clinging to the maid, saw the trust and love that Lila showed this woman who'd only been in their lives for 2 years. Something in him broke open, and he nodded slowly. What do you want me to do? That night, after Lila was asleep, Grace and Ethan sat in the kitchen with laptops and medical journals spread across the marble island. Ethan explained the technical details of the implant, how it was designed to enhance natural hearing by intercepting and amplifying neural signals. Grace listened, asked questions, and slowly began to understand the terrible beauty of what he'd created. If the implant is activating, Grace said, then there must be a way to shut it down permanently, to remove it safely. I've spent 6 years looking for that way, Ethan said wearily. The technology has advanced, but not enough. Not yet. Grace pulled up an article on her phone. What about this? Neural tissue regeneration therapy. It says they can encourage the brain to reroute around damaged areas. What if we could encourage Lila's brain to reroute around the implant, create new pathways that don't rely on it? Ethan scanned the article, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious interest. It's experimental. The success rate is low, and we'd still need to remove the implant eventually, which brings us back to the same problem. But it gives us time, Grace insisted. Time to find a better solution. Time to make sure she's strong enough to survive the removal. Before Ethan could respond, a sound cut through the quiet of the house. A scream, silent but somehow heard through vibration and instinct. They both ran for the stairs. Leila's room was chaos when they burst through the door. The little girl was sitting up in bed, her hands pressed against her ears, her mouth open in a soundless wail. The tablet on her nightstand was displaying strange symbols, the infinity loop flashing over and over. The metallic buzzing filled the room, so loud it made Grace's teeth ache. Ethan rushed to disconnect the tablet, but it didn't help. The sound was coming from Lila herself, from inside her head. The child's eyes rolled back and her body began to convulse. "She's having a seizure," Grace shouted. "Call 911. But Ethan stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of his worst nightmare coming true. Grace grabbed him and shook him hard. "Ethan, call them now." He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. Grace turned to Lila, cradling the girl's head to prevent injury. The buzzing grew louder, more intense, and Grace could feel heat emanating from behind Lila's ear. The implant was overloading. "The ambulance is delayed," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "There's a storm. They're saying 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Lila might not have 20 minutes. Grace looked at the child's face, saw the pain etched there, and made a decision. She grabbed Ethan's first aid kit from the bathroom and pulled out antiseptic and tweezers. "What are you doing?" Ethan demanded. "Something," Grace said. "I'm doing something." She sterilized the tweezers with alcohol, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Behind Lila's ear, the skin was hot and slightly swollen. Grace could feel the implant pulsing beneath the surface, could see the faint outline of metal through translucent tissue. "Grace, don't," Ethan whispered. "Please, you could kill her." "She's dying anyway," Grace said, and pressed her fingers gently against the swollen area. The skin gave way easier than she expected, the tissue already weakened by heat and stress. With the tweezers, Grace probed gently, following the outline of the device. It was small, no bigger than a hearing aid battery, but it was lodged deep. She felt resistance, felt something pulling back as if the implant had grown roots into Lila's flesh. Grace pulled harder, her jaw clenched. There was a wet, tearing sound, and then suddenly the device came free. It was a spiral of metal and circuits, no bigger than her thumbnail, covered in blood and something else, something that glowed faintly blue. The moment it left Lila's body, the buzzing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, stunning in its completeness. Lila's body went limp, her convulsions ceasing instantly. "No," Ethan breathed, falling to his knees beside the bed. "No, no, no." "What did you do?" But then Lila gasped. Her eyes fluttered open, her chest rose and fell with normal breathing, and her lips moved, forming a word that neither of them had ever heard her speak. "Grace," she whispered, her voice hoarse and small and absolutely real. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ethan stared at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. "She spoke," he said numbly. She spoke." Lila's eyes focused on her father. Her lips moved again, forming another word with painful effort. "Daddy." Ethan made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He reached for his daughter with trembling hands, but before he could touch her, Lila's body went rigid again. Her eyes rolled back and her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Something's wrong," Grace said, panic rising. "Her body's going into shock." Grace grabbed the first aid kit again, searching for anything that might help. She found an emergency epinephrine pen, the kind used for severe allergic reactions. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to try. She injected it into Lila's thigh, praying she was doing the right thing. Seconds ticked by like hours. Then Lila's breathing stabilized. Color returned to her face. Her eyes opened again, clear and focused. "It's loud," she whispered, and Grace realized with a shock what had happened. Removing the implant hadn't silenced Lila. It had freed her. Her natural hearing, suppressed for 6 years by the device, was flooding back all at once. Every sound in the world was crashing into her unprepared mind. Grace quickly grabbed noise-canceling headphones from Lila's music therapy kit and placed them gently over the child's ears. The effect was immediate. Lila relaxed, her face smoothing from pain to relief. The paramedics arrived minutes later, bursting into the room with equipment and questions. They loaded Lila onto a stretcher, firing medical terminology at Ethan that he barely processed. Grace followed them down to the ambulance, still holding the strange metallic device in her blood-stained hand. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around Lila's examination room. Grace and Ethan stood outside, watching through the window as specialists probed and scanned and murmured to each other. Finally, Dr. Sarah Bennett, the head of neurology, emerged with an expression of complete bewilderment. "I don't understand what I'm seeing," she said. "Her auditory nerves are regenerating. They're rebuilding pathways that should have never developed in the first place. It's as if her brain is rewiring itself in real time." "Is she going to be okay?" Grace asked. Dr. Bennett hesitated. "I don't know. This is beyond anything and my experience. She's stable for now, but we need to monitor her closely. The next 24 hours will be critical." As she walked away to consult with her colleagues, Grace and Ethan stood in heavy silence. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You saved her life. I was too afraid to act. And you saved her." "I just did what needed to be done," Grace said quietly. "No." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes red and raw. "You did what I should have done years ago. You were willing to risk everything for her, even though she's not your daughter, even though you could have been arrested or sued or worse." "Why?" Grace looked through the window at Lila, who was sleeping peacefully now, surrounded by machines. "Because someone should have done the same for my brother, and nobody did." Before Ethan could respond, Grace's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" A calm male voice filled her ear, sending chills down her spine. "You pulled out one of ours," the voice said. "Clever, but incomplete. There are more like her. And now that you've activated the signal, they'll all start waking up. You have no idea what you've done." The line went dead. Grace stood frozen, the stolen device still in her pocket, suddenly feeling like a bomb waiting to explode. She looked at Ethan, saw her own fear reflected in his face. "What have we done?" she whispered. Inside the hospital room, Lila stirred. She opened her eyes and turned her head toward the window, where Grace and Ethan stood. Even through the glass, even with the headphones on, her lips moved clearly, forming words that made the heart monitor spike. "I can hear them," she mouthed. "They're calling." Grace pressed her hand against the glass, and Lila's small hand reached up to mirror the gesture. Between them, invisible but undeniable, something had awakened. Something that had been waiting in the silence for 6 long years. And now, whether they were ready or not, it was time to listen. The hospital settled into an uneasy quiet as Lila's condition stabilized and the crisis moment passed. Grace dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside the bed, her body exhausted, but her mind refusing to rest completely. The mysterious phone call played on loop in her thoughts, each word dripping with implications she didn't want to consider. There are more like her. Around 3 in the morning, Grace woke to a sound that shouldn't exist. A soft humming, rhythmic and mechanical, yet strangely human in its melody. Her eyes snapped open and focused on Lila, who sat upright in bed, her eyes half closed in what looked like a trance. The child's lips moved silently at first, then began forming words that Grace could barely hear. "They're calling," Lila whispered, her voice raw from disuse. "She says it's not your fault." Grace sat forward slowly, afraid to break whatever spell had taken hold. "Who says that, sweetheart? Who's talking to you?" But Lila didn't seem to hear her. The girl's head tilted to one side, as if listening to something beyond the walls, beyond the normal range of human hearing. "Mommy says thank you. She says you saved me." The door opened quietly, and Ethan stepped inside. He'd been downstairs handling paperwork and insurance forms, but something had drawn him back. His face went pale as he heard his daughter speaking his dead wife's name. "Clara," he whispered, moving closer to the bed. "Layla, what are you hearing?" Lila's eyes opened fully, focusing on her father with an intensity that seemed wrong for a 6-year-old. "Mommy's voice. It's in the space between sounds. She's been there the whole time, waiting for me to hear her." Ethan sank into the other chair, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. "That's not possible. Your mother is dead. What you're hearing is just neural feedback, leftover signals from the implant. Your brain is trying to make sense of new sensory input." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Grace asked quietly. "That it's all just science and circuits? Maybe there's something more here." "Don't," Ethan said sharply. "Don't romanticize this. My daughter is hearing phantom signals because I put a computer in her brain before she was born. There's nothing spiritual or magical about it. It's just broken technology causing hallucinations." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed his doubt. Because Lila was speaking with Clara's inflections, using phrases that his wife had favored. Little things that this child should have no memory of, having been only hours old when her mother died. Lila turned to Grace and smiled faintly. "She says you remind her of someone brave who didn't give up." Then the girl's eyes fluttered, and she slumped back against the pillows, falling into what looked like natural sleep. Grace and Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Grace pulled out the device she'd removed from Lila's head, still wrapped in medical gauze. In the dim hospital light, the blue glow had faded, but the spiral design seemed to pulse with an inner rhythm. "I need to understand what this thing really does," Grace said, "and I think I know someone who can help." The next morning, Grace left Ethan to watch over Lila and drove across town to a small electronics repair shop in a neighborhood the tourists never visited. The sign above the door read, "Tech Haven," in flickering neon. Inside, a man in his early 30s sat hunched over a workbench, soldering components with steady hands. "Marcus," Grace called out, then caught herself. "Sorry, I mean James. James Parker." The man looked up and grinned. "Grace Williams. Been a while. What brings you to my humble shop?" James had been a friend of her late brother, one of the few people who'd believed her when she talked about the experimental procedures that killed Marcus. He'd helped her try to gather evidence, though they'd ultimately hit dead ends. He owed her nothing, but she'd helped his sister once. And he remembered. "I need you to analyze something," Grace said, placing the wrap device on his workbench. "And I need you to not ask where I got it." James unwrapped the gauze and let out a low whistle. "This is serious hardware. Military grade, maybe medical. Where did you get this?" "I pulled it out of a 6-year-old girl's head," Grace said flatly. James stared at her, then at the device, then back at her. "You're not joking." "I wish I was. Can you scan it? Figure out what it does?" James picked up the device carefully with tweezers and moved to a diagnostic station equipped with microscopes and scanning equipment. He worked in silence for nearly an hour, while Grace paced the small shop, checking her phone for updates from Ethan. Finally, James called her over. "This is insane," he said, pulling up readings on his computer screen. "This isn't just a cochlear implant. It's a neural interface with wireless capability, data storage, and what looks like an audio recording system." "Recording what?" "Everything. Every sound the person hears. Every neural pattern associated with processing those sounds. It's like a black box for the human auditory system." James zoomed in on one section of the scan. "But here's the really disturbing part. There's an embedded file in the storage, an audio log." Grace's heart began to race. "Can you play it?" James hesitated, then nodded. He connected the device to his system and pulled up the file. A woman's voice filled the small shop, clear and sad, and unmistakably real. "If you're hearing this, it means she can hear me too. My name is Clara Cole. I'm making this recording 2 days before my scheduled delivery, in case something goes wrong. Ethan and I created something revolutionary, something that could change the world. But I'm scared. The preliminary tests show my neural pathways are rejecting the interface. The doctors say I might not survive the birth." Clara's voice broke, and there was the sound of her taking a steadying breath. "But if my daughter lives, if the implant integrates with her system, Then maybe my consciousness can survive too. We programmed the device to record my neural patterns, my thoughts, my memories. It's not immortality, but it's something. A ghost in the machine. A mother's voice preserved in circuits and code. There was a long pause. Then Clara spoke again, softer this time. Layla, if you're hearing this, if you've grown old enough to access these files, know that I loved you before you took your first breath, and if I'm gone, know that I built a bridge for us, between silence and sound, between death and memory. Listen carefully, sweetheart. I'll always be here, waiting in the spaces between. The recording ended. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. James looked equally shaken. That's not possible, James whispered. You can't record consciousness. You can't preserve a person's mind in a computer chip. Maybe not all of it, Grace said slowly, but maybe enough. Enough to leave echoes. Enough to guide her daughter when she finally learned to hear. James disconnected the device and wrapped it carefully. Grace, this technology, if it got out, if people knew what it could do, the implications would be massive. Medical, military, ethical. This is the kind of thing people kill for. I know, Grace said, thinking of the phone call, of Dr. Vance's warning. That's why I need you to make a copy of everything on this device, every file, every recording, every piece of data. Can you do that? I can, but it'll take time. I'll wait. While James worked, Grace called Ethan. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with stress. Where are you? Lila's asking for you. I'm following a lead. How is she? Confused, overwhelmed. The doctors say her hearing is stabilizing, but she keeps talking about voices that no one else can hear. They want to run psychiatric evaluations. Don't let them, Grace said firmly. She's not crazy. She's hearing exactly what she's supposed to hear. I'll explain when I get back. Grace hung up and turned back to James, who was staring at his screen with an expression of growing horror. What is it? She asked. I found something else in the device's memory. Communication logs. This implant was receiving signals from an external source, multiple sources actually, all using the same network protocol, all carrying the infinity symbol as an identifier. Grace's blood ran cold. How many sources? James scrolled through the data. At least 30, maybe more. They're scattered across the country, but they're all active, all pinging each other like nodes in a network. 30 children, Grace breathed. 30 kids with these things in their heads. And someone is controlling them, James added, or trying to. The signals increased dramatically in the last 72 hours. Someone is attempting to activate all the implants simultaneously. Grace grabbed her phone and dialed the number from the mysterious call. It rang once, twice, then connected. The same calm male voice answered. I wondered when you'd call back. Dr. Vance, I presume. A pause. You've been doing research. Good. That will save time. What do you want with these children? The same thing Ethan wanted before he lost his nerve. To unlock human potential. To transcend the limitations of natural biology. Those children are the future, Miss Williams. And you've just woken them up. By removing the implant from Lila. By severing her connection, you sent a signal through the entire network. A termination code that the other implants interpreted as an activation trigger. Ironic, really. You were trying to save one child, and instead you've endangered 30 more. Grace's grip on the phone tightened. Tell me how to stop it. You can't, not alone. But I can. Bring me the device you removed and I'll shut down the network. All those children will go back to their normal lives, none the wiser. And if I don't, then their implants will continue activating. And some of them will die, just like Clara did. Neural rejection is a terrible way to go, Miss Williams. I'd hate to see children suffer that fate. Grace looked at James, who was shaking his head frantically. Don't trust him, he mouthed. I need time to think. Grace said. "You have 24 hours. Then I activate the network myself. And whatever happens, happens. The choice is yours." The call ended. Grace stood trembling, the weight of 30 lives suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. "He's bluffing," James said. "He has to be." "What if he's not?" Before James could answer, Grace's phone rang again. This time it was Ethan, and his voice was pure panic. "You need to get back here now. They're here." "Who's here?" "Men in suits. They say they're from the government, but I don't believe them. They're trying to take Lila into protective custody. They say she's evidence in a federal investigation." Grace's heart plummeted. "Don't let them take her. I'm on my way." She grabbed the device from James and ran for her car. Behind her, James called out, "Grace, wait, let me help." But there wasn't time. Grace drove through Atlanta traffic like a woman possessed, running red lights and weaving between lanes. Her phone rang constantly, but she ignored it, her focus entirely on reaching the hospital before those men disappeared with Lila. She screeched into the hospital parking lot and ran through the sliding doors, not caring about the stairs she drew. On Lila's floor, she found chaos. Hospital security stood outside the room, while two men in dark suits argued with Ethan, who'd positioned himself in the doorway like a human shield. "You can't take her without a court order," Ethan was saying, his voice deadly calm despite the fury in his eyes. "This is a matter of national security," one of the men replied. "The device in your daughter's possession contains classified technology. We're authorized to retrieve it by any means necessary." Grace pushed through the gathering crowd. "She doesn't have it, I do." All eyes turned to her. The suited men exchanged glances, then moved toward her with practiced efficiency. But Grace was faster. She pulled the device from her pocket and held it over a trash can that contained medical waste marked for incineration. "One more step and I drop it," she said. "From what I understand, these things don't respond well to sudden impacts." The men froze. One of them smiled without humor. "You're making a mistake, Miss Williams." "Probably, but it's my mistake to make." Ethan used the distraction to slip back into Lila's room. Through the open door, Grace could see him lifting his daughter from the bed, wrapping her in a blanket. He caught Grace's eye and mouthed one word. "Run." Grace understood immediately. She threw the device at the suited men and bolted for the stairwell. Behind her, she heard shouting and running footsteps. She took the stairs 3 at a time, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. On the ground floor, she burst through the exit and found Ethan's car idling at the emergency entrance. The back door was open. She dove inside, and Ethan hit the gas before she'd even closed the door. "Where are we going?" Grace gasped. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find us." In the back seat, wrapped in blankets and wearing noise-canceling headphones, Lila looked small and frightened. She reached for Grace's hand and held it tight. As they sped through the city, Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should have taken my offer. Now everyone pays the price." Grace looked at Ethan, saw the grim determination on his face, and realized they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. They were fugitives now, running from forces they barely understood, protecting a child who carried secrets that powerful people would kill for. "There's a place," Ethan said quietly, "where Cole Biotech used to do research. It's been abandoned for years, but I still have access. We can hide there while we figure out what to do next." "And then what?" Grace asked. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Then we finish what I started. We find everyone involved in Project Echo and we burn it all down, no matter what it costs me." Lila stirred in the back seat, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Mommy says the place isn't empty. She says something's waiting there." Grace and Ethan exchanged worried glances, but they had nowhere else to go. As thunder rumbled overhead and rain began to fall, they drove toward an abandoned research facility that held the keys to both salvation and destruction. Behind them, unseen and unheard, A network of 30 children across America began to wake up. Their implants pulsed with new life, connecting them in ways their parents could never imagine. And in the spaces between their thoughts, in the silence that most humans never noticed, something ancient and patient stirred. The signal was complete. Phase 2 had begun. Rain hammered against the windshield as they drove deeper into the industrial outskirts of Atlanta, where abandoned warehouses stood like forgotten monuments to failed ambitions. The old coal biotech research facility loomed ahead, a concrete structure half hidden by overgrown vegetation and rusted chain-link fencing. Ethan pulled the car through a gap in the fence, the tires splashing through puddles that reflected the angry sky above. "This is where it all started," Ethan said quietly as he killed the engine. "Where Clara and I thought we were going to change the world." Grace looked at the building and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Windows were broken, graffiti covered the lower walls, and something about the place felt wrong, as if the building itself remembered the tragedies that had occurred within its walls. Lila stirred in the back seat, pulling off her headphones. "It's loud here," she whispered. "Not sounds. Something else, like electricity in the air." Ethan helped his daughter out of the car while Grace grabbed the emergency bag they'd hastily packed at the hospital. They approached the main entrance, where Ethan swiped an old keycard. To Grace's surprise, the lock disengaged with a mechanical click. The power was still on. "I kept it active," Ethan explained, seeing her expression. "Couldn't bring myself to let it die completely. Part of me always knew I'd have to come back here eventually." They entered a lobby thick with dust and shadows. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Their footsteps echoed on cracked tile as they moved deeper into the building. Grace stayed close to Lila, whose eyes darted nervously at every shadow. As they descended a stairwell to the lower levels, the air grew colder and the shadows deeper. The walls were covered with old safety posters and directional signs pointing to laboratories and testing facilities. Grace noticed rooms labeled with numbers and letters, but one door stood out, marked simply, "Neural Core Link." "That's where we need to go," Ethan said, his voice heavy with dread. "That's where the main server is. If we can access it, we might be able to shut down the network before Vance activates all the implants." But as they approached the door, the lights suddenly blazed to full brightness. Computer systems hummed to life all around them. Screens flickered on, displaying streams of data and the infinity symbol pulsing rhythmically. The building wasn't just active, it was awake. "Welcome home, Ethan." The voice came from speakers embedded in the ceiling. Dr. Noah Vance's calm, measured tone filled the corridor. Grace pulled Lila close as Ethan's face hardened. "You couldn't just let it die, could you?" Vance continued. "You had to keep the facility running, keep the servers active. Made it very easy for me to monitor. I've been watching you since the moment you drove through the gate." "Show yourself," Ethan shouted at the ceiling. "In time. First, I want you to understand what you're seeing. Look at the screens, Ethan. Look at what we've accomplished." The monitors around them changed, displaying live feeds of children across America. Grace's heart sank as she recognized the pattern. These were the other implant recipients, and they were all responding to the signal. Some were in hospitals, surrounded by confused doctors. Others were in their homes, their parents holding them as they trembled and whispered to invisible voices. 32 children, Vance said, each one carrying a piece of Clara's legacy, each one connected to a network that transcends individual consciousness. They're not hearing voices, Ethan. They're hearing each other, a shared neural space where thoughts become sound and sound becomes understanding. "You're killing them," Grace said, her voice shaking with rage. "Just like you killed Clara. Clara died because the technology wasn't ready, but 6 years of refinement, 6 years of watching, and waiting. And now it is. These children won't die. They'll evolve. They'll become something greater than human. The next step in our species' development. A door at the end of the corridor opened, and Dr. Noah Vance stepped through. He was younger than Grace had imagined, maybe mid-40s, with sharp features and eyes that gleamed with zealous conviction. He wore a white lab coat over expensive clothes, and on his wrist, the infinity symbol gleamed in platinum. "You were always too sentimental, Ethan," Vance said, walking toward them. "Too attached to individual lives to see the bigger picture." Clara understood. She volunteered knowing the risks because she believed in the vision. She believed in helping people here. Ethan shot back, "Not in turning children into experiments for your twisted ambitions." Semantics. Vance pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen. Immediately, Lila gasped and pressed her hands to her head. "Every implant in the network responds to my commands. I can activate them, enhance them, or shut them down permanently. The choice is mine." Grace stepped forward, putting herself between Vance and Lila. "Let them go. All of them. They're children, not your property." "They're the future," Vance corrected. "And the future doesn't belong to people who are content with limitations. Ethan, you have a choice. Help me complete the network integration. Ensure your daughter survives the process, or resist and watch as I force the activation anyway." Either way, Project Echo reaches its conclusion tonight. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Grace could see the war raging behind his eyes. Everything he'd tried to prevent, everything he'd sacrificed to keep buried, was about to be unleashed. And this time, he was the only one who could stop it. "There's a third option," Ethan said quietly. He moved with sudden speed, rushing past Vance and through the door to the neural core link chamber. Vance cursed and followed, with Grace and Lila close behind. The room beyond was massive, filled with servers stacked floor to ceiling, their lights blinking like a field of electronic stars. In the center stood a control console with multiple screens displaying the neural network in real time. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing systems he'd built years ago. "I designed a failsafe," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "A way to destroy everything if it ever fell into the wrong hands. I just never thought I'd have to use it." "Don't!" Vance grabbed Ethan's shoulder, trying to pull him away from the console. The two men struggled, knocking equipment to the floor. Grace shielded Lila with her body as monitors sparked and crashed around them. "Grace!" Ethan shouted, throwing Vance backward. "The red drive in the main server. Pull it out." Grace looked frantically at the wall of servers, searching for anything red. Lila suddenly pointed at a unit near the ceiling. "There! I can hear it humming. Different from the others." Grace ran to the server and climbed the metal framework, her fingers reaching for the drive Lila had indicated. Behind her, she heard Vance roar in fury and the sound of something heavy hitting flesh. She glanced back and saw Ethan on the ground, blood streaming from his nose. "Pull it," Ethan gasped. "Before he stops you." Grace's fingers closed around the drive. She yanked hard and it came free with a shower of sparks. Immediately, half the servers went dark. The humming that had filled the room dropped to a whisper. "No." Vance scrambled toward the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "You've disabled the safety protocols. If I activate the network now without the regulatory systems, the signal will burn out every implant simultaneously." "I know," Ethan said, pulling himself to his feet. "That's the point. Better they lose the implants than lose their lives. You'll kill your daughter too. The removal shock will stop her heart." Ethan looked at Lila, his eyes filling with tears. "I know, but it's the only way to save the others." "No." Grace climbed down and ran to Ethan. "There has to be another way. We can't just sacrifice her. If we don't, 32 children die," Ethan said, his voice breaking. including her. At least this way, the others survive. Lila stepped forward, her small hand reaching for her father's. She looked up at him with eyes far older than her 6 years, and when she spoke, it wasn't entirely her voice anymore. Clara's inflection colored every word. You don't have to sacrifice her, but you do have to let me go. Ethan's face crumpled. Clara, I'm here. I've always been here, waiting in the spaces between signals. My consciousness was never fully preserved, just echoes and fragments. But those pieces have been protecting Lila, filtering the network's signals, keeping the worst of it from reaching her mind. If you destroy the network, those echoes disappear too, for good this time. I can't lose you again. Ethan whispered. You already lost me, my love, 6 years ago. This is just letting go of the ghost. Lila's face softened, becoming fully Clara's expression. But our daughter is real. She's alive. And she deserves a chance to hear the world without my voice overshadowing hers. Let me go. Save them all. Ethan fell to his knees, sobbing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I know, and I forgive you. Now finish it. Ethan pulled himself together and turned to the console. His fingers moved with purpose now, entering commands that would set the self-destruct sequence in motion. Vance tried to stop him, but Grace grabbed a fallen monitor and swung it hard, catching the doctor in the shoulder. He went down cursing. The sequence is starting, Ethan said, his voice mechanical with grief. We have 5 minutes before this whole facility explodes. The electromagnetic pulse will fry every server, destroy every backup, and send a termination signal to all the implants in the network. They'll all shut down permanently. And Lila? Grace asked, her heart in her throat. The implant is already gone from her head. The echoes of Clara's consciousness are in the network itself, not in Lila anymore. She'll survive. The others will survive. But everything else ends here. Alarms began blaring. Emergency lights flashed red. The building groaned as systems began systematically shutting down. Ethan recorded a final message on his phone, his hands steady despite the chaos. My name is Ethan Cole. I created Project Echo with the intention of helping people, but I let my ambition blind me to the cost. My wife died because of my arrogance. 32 children were experimented on without their consent. Tonight I'm ending it. I'm destroying all the research, all the data, all the evidence of what we did. The children will be free, and I'll face whatever consequences come with that choice. He saved the file and sent it to multiple recipients, news outlets, government agencies, medical boards. Within minutes, the truth about Project Echo would be public knowledge. There would be no covering this up, no protecting his reputation. He was burning it all down, including himself. We need to go, Grace said, pulling at his arm. You go, take Lila, get her out of here. What? No, you're coming with us. Ethan shook his head, looking at Vance, who was slowly getting to his feet. Someone needs to make sure he doesn't stop the sequence. Someone needs to stay and see this through. Ethan, don't do this, Grace pleaded. Lila needs her father. She needs someone who'll protect her, someone who'll teach her that doing the right thing matters more than protecting yourself. That's you, Grace. You've been more of a parent to her than I ever was. Ethan pulled Grace into a quick, fierce hug. Take care of my daughter. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't be the father she deserved. He pushed Grace toward the door. She stumbled, then looked back at him with tears streaming down her face. Ethan had already turned to the console, entering final commands. Behind him, Vance lunged forward with a piece of metal pipe, but Ethan was ready. The 2 men crashed into the server banks, sparks flying. Grace grabbed Lila's hand and ran. The little girl looked back once at her father, her lips forming words Grace couldn't hear over the alarms. They raced through corridors filling with smoke, climbed the stairwell as explosions echoed from below, and burst out into the rain-soaked night just as the facility's roof began to collapse. They ran to the car, and Grace drove like fury itself was chasing them. Behind them, the Cole Biotech building erupted in a massive fireball. The explosion lit up the night sky, turning rain to gold, as 32 children across America suddenly went silent. The voices in their heads, the humming that had filled their minds, all of it stopped. The network was dead. Grace pulled over a mile away and held Lila as the child sobbed. She didn't know if Lila was crying for her father, for her mother's final goodbye, or for the sudden silence where the voices had been. Maybe all three. Grace cried, too, for the man who'd finally found courage in his last moments, and for the little girl who'd lost everything. When the tears finally stopped, Lila looked up at Grace with red, swollen eyes. "Mommy's really gone now, isn't she?" "Yes, sweetheart, but she was proud of you. So proud. And Daddy?" Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but Lila deserved the truth. "Your daddy did something very brave. He saved a lot of people. He saved you." Lila was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered something that broke and healed Grace's heart simultaneously. "I can still hear them sometimes. Not the voices, not the network, just memories, like echoes. Is that okay?" "That's perfect," Grace said, kissing the girl's forehead. "That's exactly how it should be." 6 months passed like a dream wrapped in grief. The investigation into Project Echo dominated headlines for weeks. Grace testified before congressional committees, medical boards, and criminal courts. The full scope of what Cole Biotech had done came to light, and while Ethan Cole was officially listed as deceased, his final message ensured that his crimes wouldn't be forgotten. Dr. Noah Vance survived the explosion, but faced federal charges that would keep him imprisoned for life. The 32 children, including Lila, received ongoing medical care and counseling. Most of them recovered fully, their natural hearing intact once the implants were removed. A few had complications, but they were alive. That was what mattered. Grace now lived in a modest suburban home with Lila, who attended a special school for gifted children. The girl thrived there, learning and growing in ways that filled Grace with pride. Lila had taken to teaching other children sign language, bridging worlds between those who heard and those who didn't. On a warm spring afternoon, Grace stood in the school's art room, watching as Lila painted at an easel. The girl had developed a talent for visual arts, her paintings vibrant and emotional. This one showed 2 figures holding hands beneath a starry sky, one adult and one child. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Grace said. "Who are they?" "You and me," Lila said simply. "But also Mommy and Daddy. They're up there now, in the stars. Sometimes I paint them so I don't forget what they looked like." Grace knelt beside her, studying the painting more closely. The adult figures seemed to shimmer, as if made of light itself. "Do you miss them?" "Every day. But I have you, and that makes it okay." Later that week, Grace attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony downtown. The Clara Cole Hearing Initiative was officially launching, a foundation dedicated to ethical hearing research and support for families affected by Project Echo. The organizations had been funded by Ethan's estate, which he'd willed entirely to this purpose in a document dated the day before his death. He'd known what he was going to do, had planned for it, had made sure something good would come from the ashes. Grace stood beside the ceremony leaders, humble in a simple blue dress. Reporters asked her questions about Ethan, about Clara, about the children. She answered carefully, honestly, trying to honor the truth without sensationalizing the tragedy. "Do you think Ethan Cole was a hero or a villain?" one reporter asked. Grace considered the question carefully. "I think he was human. He made terrible mistakes that cost lives. But in the end, he chose to sacrifice everything to make it right. That doesn't erase what he did, but it matters. It has to matter. After the ceremony, Grace and Lila visited the memorial site where the research facility had once stood. The city had cleared the rubble and planted a garden there, with a simple stone marker listing the names of those who died because of Project Echo. Clara Cole's name was at the top. Ethan's name was at the bottom, separate with the words, "Who died ensuring this never happens again," carved beneath. Lila placed flowers at the base of the stone and stood silently for a moment. Grace watched her, this remarkable child who'd survived so much, who carried the weight of two worlds inside her. "Miss Grace," Lila said, turning around, "can I ask you something?" "Anything, baby." The lawyer said, "Daddy left me everything, his money, his house, everything. But you take care of it all. Why?" Grace smiled and took Lila's hand. "Because money doesn't make a family. Love does. Taking care of each other does. Your daddy knew that at the end. That's why he trusted me to watch over you until you're old enough to decide what to do with it all yourself. What should I do with it? Whatever your heart tells you. You've got time to figure it out." They walked through the memorial garden together, listening to birds sing and wind rustle through new leaves. Lila stopped suddenly and tilted her head, that familiar gesture that meant she was listening to something beyond normal hearing. "What is it?" Grace asked. "Just the world," Lila said, smiling. "It's so loud, so beautiful. I never want to forget how lucky I am to hear it." That evening, as Grace tucked Lila into bed in their small but cozy home, the girl pulled something from under her pillow. It was a small metal pendant on a delicate chain, shaped like the infinity symbol, but engraved with new words. "Connection lives on." "Where did you get that?" Grace asked, recognizing the symbol that had haunted this entire journey. "I found it. At the memorial site, in the grass. I think Daddy left it for me, or maybe Mommy, I don't know, but I want to keep it. Is that okay?" Grace touched the pendant gently. It was warm, almost alive. "Of course it's okay. Your parents loved you very much. This can be your way of remembering them." Lila fastened the chain around her neck and settled back into her pillows. "Grace, are you my family now?" "If you want me to be." "I do. You're the best family I could ask for." Grace kissed Lila's forehead and turned off the light, leaving only a soft nightlight glowing. As she reached the door, Lila called out one more time. "Grace, thank you for saving me." "You saved yourself, sweetheart. I just held your hand while you did it." Grace closed the door gently and walked to her own room. She sat at her small desk and opened her journal, the same worn book she'd been writing in for years. On a fresh page, she wrote about the day, about Lila's progress, about the bittersweet joy of watching a child heal. And at the bottom, she wrote the words that had carried her through everything. "Maybe helping her will make it right this time." Then she crossed them out and wrote something new. It wasn't about making things right. It was about choosing love over fear, courage over safety, connection over silence. And in the end, that's what saved us both. Outside, a soft breeze passed through the neighborhood, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter. Two voices, intertwined and distant, like memories preserved in starlight. Clara and Ethan, together in whatever space exists between life and death, watching over the daughter they'd loved enough to set free. And in her bed, Lila smiled in her sleep, the infinity pendant resting gently against her heart, as the world sang its endless song through her dreams. In a world built on silence, it wasn't science that gave her voice. It was love that made her listen. If you had the power to give someone back what they'd lost, but it meant risking everything you had, would you have the courage to pull the trigger? If this story moved you, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew.